Welcome to the Power of Reading, a book review program that discusses the latest Catholic books. A book is a dream you hold in your hand. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.
Hello and welcome to the Power of Reading program here on Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home, 107.3 FM. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul, and in this Power of Reading program, we continue to introduce to you the important, the classical, the latest Catholic books. And in this program, of course, we promote and revive the reading culture because we believe that reading has good and lasting effects on our faith as Christians and also in our everyday life. And of course, today we realize that reading is very much challenged because of the great progress we have in modern technology, which has changed the way we have access to information. But we still believe that the written word, the book, has a very special place in our journey as human beings, in our way of learning, in our way of growing, in our way of deepening our faith. And the book is still one of the best inventions in human history and in the development of the human person. Now, today I would want us to start a journey with the book that we are going to be presenting in the next 2 or 3 programs. And this book is called The Gift of the Sunday Eucharist, The Gift of the Sunday Eucharist in an African Perspective. And this is a book written by an author that we have actually encountered again in this program. That is Father Rinaldo Ronzani. Father Rinaldo Ronzani is a Comboni missionary who was a missionary here in Kenya, but right now he is back to Italy due to health reasons. And Father Rinaldo actually is the liturgist. He's an expert in liturgy. He has written extensively on the sacraments, on the liturgy. He is also the general editor of the liturgical books that are published by Pauline's Publications Africa. And what Father Alberone does here is to take this gift of the Sunday Eucharist and try to give us reflections and to give a great encouragement to our local churches, especially during this time when we are talking about the synodal journey, where we are called to journey together as people of God. And he says that by rediscovering the centrality and meaning of the gift of the Eucharist, then we shall be able to celebrate it in a prayerful and more loving manner, and to be able also to respond to the saving action of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in us, and also to become effective and enthusiastic evangelizers. So this book actually, according to him, is a book that he has prepared for the priests, the religious, the lay leaders, the small Christian communities, the different groups that we find within our church, and actually is a book that I would also really want to recommend. It's a brand new book. It's actually a few weeks old, and this book actually is a beautiful book that Father Rinaldo has prepared for us, and also owing to his experience as a pastor, especially in the northern part of Kenya, Marsabit, also in West Pokot, and of course as a lecturer of theology in Catholic University of Eastern Africa, Tangaza University College, St. Thomas Aquinas Major Seminary, and also Hekima College, the Jesuit Hekima College. And actually what Father has done, he has divided this book into 10 chapters, but these chapters are divided into 2 parts. The first part, which is made up of 3 chapters, gives us a biblical, historical, and theological foundation of this book and of this topic of the Eucharist. And these are, according to what I have experienced reading this book of Father Rinaldo, is the great importance of the foundation that we find, biblical foundation, historical, and of course theological foundation of the Eucharist. Many people ask, why do we celebrate the Mass as Catholics? Why are we so attached to the Mass as Catholics? And here we find very profound answers. And these are topics sometimes we may need to discuss in our small Christian communities, in our groups, in our families. And in chapter 1, he deals with the gift of the Eucharist in the New Testament. That is from the New Testament. Then he talks about a brief history of the Mass, And then chapter 3, he talks about the gathering of the Christian community gathered in communion. In part 2, he does a very important work. Here, he deals with the celebration of the Sunday Eucharist. Sunday is paramount for us. Sunday is so important for us as Christians and as Catholics. So from chapter 4 to chapter 9, he takes us through the whole Mass. What are we doing? What is happening? What is supposed to be our disposition? And chapter 4, he talks about the introductory rites. And in each chapter, he also gives some insights. And the insight he gives here is the gifts that we receive during the introductory rites of the Mass. And that is the gifts of mercy and of praise. Then chapter 5, he deals with the liturgy of the word when we read the gospel, the first, second reading. And the insight here is nourished by God's word. Chapter 6 is the liturgy of the Eucharist, that is the presentation of the gifts and the wonderful exchange that takes place between God and his people. Chapter 7 is the liturgy of the Eucharist, that is the Eucharistic prayer. I know most of the time probably you don't pay much attention to the Eucharistic prayer, which is actually so important because it is the summary, or we can say it is the fullness of praise, of joy, of thanksgiving as a community. And the liturgy of the Eucharist is the Eucharistic prayer, which is prayed with grateful hearts. And of course, chapter 8, he deals with the liturgy of the Eucharist. That is the central elements of the Eucharistic prayer and the mystery of faith. Then chapter 9 is the liturgy of the Eucharist, the communion rite called the Supper of the Lord. Then chapter 10 is the concluding rites. That is when we are sent forth to continue the mission of Christ. So the book that we are reviewing today, The Gift of the Sunday Eucharist in an African Perspective, a book that has been prepared and written by a great liturgist and theologian, Father Rinaldo Ronzani, Comboni missionary, has 10 chapters that deal with the whole idea of the Mass. So we are going to take a short break. And after the break, I would also want to share a little the foreword of this book that was prepared by the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Nairobi, a Most Reverend Philip Anyolo. And of course, also the introduction that also Father gives of the book and why he chose to prepare this book for us as the faithful. So let's take a break as we come and start expounding this beautiful book, The Gift of the Eucharist in an African Perspective, a book that is written by Father Rinaldo Ronzani. Welcome back to the Power of Reading program here on Radio Maria Nairobi, 107.3 FM, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. And today in our Power of Reading program, we are reviewing the book, The Gift of the Sunday Eucharist in an African Perspective. And this is a book that has been written by Father Rinaldo Ronzani, a Comboni missionary. Now, this book also has a foreword and actually an introduction. The foreword has been written by His Grace Archbishop Philip Anyolo, the Metropolitan Archbishop of Nairobi. And actually, what he says is very important. And he says that actually, Father is responding to Pope Francis' invitation. And also in communion with the whole church, we together embark on what we are calling the synodal journey. And the Archbishop actually reminds us that like Abraham, our father in faith, we are called to put our trust in God, who through the Holy Spirit will lead us along the road of participation, communion, and mission. And this is not the road less traveled. It is the road that the church has always traveled, from the choice of Matthias immediately after the ascension of the Lord up to the present day. And of course, the Archbishop talks about having this deep listening to God and the work of the Holy Spirit in the church. And he says that our Sunday celebration, the Eucharist, the Sunday Mass, plays a very important role in this, because as we listen to the Word of God and celebrate the Paschal mystery, we are challenged to live according to the mind of Jesus Christ and to remain a gospel-inspired and mission-oriented church. So the purpose also of the Sunday Eucharist, according to the Archbishop giving a foreword to this book, is to remind us that it gives us an orientation as a church to be missionary-oriented. And of course, he recommends the work of Father Rinaldo Ronzani as a work that can help us as Christ's faithful to carry out the ministry that has been entrusted to us. And whenever we are called upon to play a key role during the Eucharist on Sunday, we should feel so proud, so happy, and so blessed. The priest is given the role to celebrate the Eucharist, to consecrate the bread and wine. Others are called to be readers, lectors. Others are called to be in the choir. Others are called to give other services within the Eucharist, which the Archbishop says it's very, very important that we are able to enter into the mystery of Christ as a community of believers who celebrate the diversity and the gifts that God has given us so that we can make this world a better place. In the introduction, Father Rinaldo takes us through the process of this book and the writing of this book. And that is also very important, especially when we read great works of literature, to understand the reason behind a writing of a certain particular book or a particular piece of work. And one of the things that has inspired Father so much, especially in his work in trying to bring the liturgy closer to the Christians, is first of all the work that has been done by the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. And he says actually about 20 years ago, in March 2002, the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments published the third typical edition of the Roman Missal in Latin. Immediately afterwards, the bishops' conferences began its translation into the local languages. And of course, the English translation was prepared by ICEL. ICEL is the International Commission for English in the Liturgy. And it was actually finally approved in the year 2010 and was then made available to all the English-speaking world, including the English-speaking Africa. These changes are very, very important. And he says that as a missionary priest, he was always fascinated by the Vatican II reform of the Mass. And he says he feels that it deserves prayerful study and meditation, because the Eucharist is not only the sacrament that completes the journey of Christian initiation and reveals our identity, but is indeed the source and summit of our Christian life and mission. and it is also the gift that gives new meaning to our existence and strengthens us in our journey towards the heavenly Jerusalem. So also it's very important to understand the Eucharist as a sacrament, a celebration that journeys with us. And he says that one of the things that we have to celebrate as we review this book, The Gift of the Sunday Eucharist, is that the Eucharist is the gift par excellence. And we know that the church has received the Eucharist from Christ her Lord, not as one gift, however, among so many other gifts. We have received so many gifts from God, but the gift par excellence that God has given us is actually the Eucharist, because it is the gift of himself, of his person, in his sacred humanity, as well as the gift of his saving work. So the gift of the Eucharist is very, very important. And he quotes Pope John Paul, I think it's Pope John Paul II, who wrote the Eucharist and the Church. I think the encyclical in Italian was Ecclesia di Eucharistia. He says that Eucharist is very important since it brings to us all that Christ is, all that he did and suffered for all of us, and participates in the divine eternity, and so transcends all time. So the Eucharist is timeless. It's beyond time. It's not confined with time. And these words, he says, should challenge us to receive the Eucharist as the most precious gift of Christ that he has given us, to be aware of the spiritual richness that we encounter or receive through the Eucharist. And of course, in the Eucharist, it's very important for us to bow in prayer and adoration and to open our hearts to the great love of the Trinity that transforms us into new creatures. Father Rinaldo also, in his introduction, besides telling us that the Eucharist is a gift par excellence, he also says that there's a great importance in the liturgical celebration of the Sunday Mass. The Sunday is the day of the Lord. The Sunday is the day we remember the resurrection of the Lord. Sunday is not just any other day. It's a day that is of great, great importance. And it is important that the entire community assembles, and this is the primary manifestation of the local church and most important and normative form of the Eucharistic celebration. And this also is taken from the Second Vatican document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, number 28. And of course, he says that we shall therefore focus our attention on some of the prayers, verbal language, rites, signs and gestures, non-verbal language, that we repeat every Sunday. So he also wants us, in this book, actually, he takes care of every aspect of what we do and say and pray during the Sunday Mass and try to understand it. And he says that these reflections on the liturgical celebration of the Sunday Mass are guided by three vital and interconnected themes, namely, one, the primacy of God's saving action, our response to God's gift as a community, and also within our African context, because we respond to God as we are and where we find ourselves. Of course, he also talks about the Eucharist as the primacy of God's saving action. The Eucharist as the primacy of God's saving action. And he says that also in this book, he wants to highlight deeply and to explain the primacy of God's saving action in the liturgical celebration. And we usually, most of the time, look at the Mass as something that we do, and at times we overlook the most important dimension, namely that the liturgy is the saving action of the Trinity in us. As we go for Mass, it's not what I'll do or not do, but also is how God is going to touch my life, transform me, and help me to grow. This is of great, great importance, and actually it is very, very important for us also as Christians to pay attention to these details about the Eucharist. I know sometimes we have a lot of discussions in our small Christian communities, our groups, in the church about the liturgy, sometimes even of minute things or what we would call less important things, and we miss the point of the most important things that we are supposed to do during the Eucharist. And actually, Father is very bold. He says that one of the most important things to understand is that the Eucharist is God's saving action And actually, we are supposed to receive this as a gift. It's not that God really needs our liturgies. No, God does not need the Mass. We are the ones who need the Mass. He says that the liturgy is, as we know from our Catholic doctrine, the saving action of the Trinity in us and in the world, in the church and in the world. So also when we are celebrating the Mass, it is not just something that happens to us as Catholics, but it's something that actually, in truth and honesty, something that transforms the world. He also quotes St. Benedict in his rule, who refers to the liturgy and the common prayer as Opus Dei. It's God's work, to remind his monks and also ourselves that God is the active subject of liturgy and that we respond to his call by coming together as a liturgical assembly. And in the Mass, it is the whole Christ who acts head and body. And so the celebration of the liturgy is a divine human reality in which the primacy belongs to God's action. God takes the initiative to reach out to us, and his saving gifts, which always comes first, prompts our human response and gives it its full meaning. And at Mass, both divine and human dimensions blend together. That is also very, very important. And this is what creates the deep communion that we experience in the liturgy. And of course, he also talks about our response as a Christian community. How do I respond individually and also as a community? How do we prepare? How do we carry ourselves during the Eucharist? How do we respond during Mass? And all those aspects, which are very, very important. And he says this way of responding, our response to God actually is our gift back to God. God who has given us the gift of his saving help and power in the Eucharist. Then, of course, he talks about the African perspective, and he says he'll try to give reference to African culture and also to understand how the Mass can become life to us, no matter the situation in which we find ourselves, with our own traditional values, our own ways of life, and how the Eucharist can also evangelize these ways. But at the same time, through our positive values in our culture, we can also enrich the Eucharist. So this is very important for him. And he actually says the birth of this book actually began also as a series of retreats, of talks and homilies that he has given to priests, sisters, seminarians, and the ordinary faithful on the mystery of the Eucharist over the years. And he says that many people encouraged him to put them together in a book format as a useful formation for liturgical ongoing formation. Liturgical ongoing formation, because this is also very, very important. And this is a work that also he has done during a time also he was struggling with his own health, but the Lord was able to give him that gift to be able to share with us this great wealth that he has and the great experience he has of the Lord through the Eucharist and through the liturgy as a liturgist, as a theologian, and also as a priest. So we are going to take another short break as we come and look at the first chapter of this book that talks about the gift of the Eucharist in the New Testament. Welcome back to the Power of Reading program here on Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home 107.3 FM. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. And today in our book review program, we have started reviewing a very beautiful work of liturgy that has been prepared for us by Father Rinaldo Ronzani, and that is the gift of the Sunday Eucharist in an African perspective. We've already seen the rationale or the reason behind the preparation of this book, and I would want us already to get into the first chapter. And in chapter 1, Father Rinaldo presents to us the gift of the Eucharist, the gift of the Eucharist in the New Testament, the gift of the Eucharist in the New Testament. Remember, this book, as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, is divided into two parts. The first part has 3 chapters, and this first part deals with the biblical, historical, and theological foundations of the Eucharist, and part 2 deals directly with the celebration of the Sunday Eucharist. And we see that in the New Testament, he says that for us to be able to grasp the beauty and spiritual richness of the gift of the Sunday Eucharist and take full, active, and conscious participation in it, we need to look at some of the key passages that we find there. But he says, of course, he may not be able to do all the biblical passages that are connected to the Eucharist, but he'll try to do a few of them that can help us. Of course, the title he gives us tells us that he is talking about the gifts of the Eucharist in the New Testament, but actually he also takes us through the Old Testament images, even though he's talking about the New Testament. Actually, where we have the institution of the Eucharist, he takes us through the Old Testament images, and he says that the Old Testament offers us a variety of images that point in the direction of the Eucharist, and he says he'll mention only a few of them and also the most relevant. So he'll mention a few of them and the most relevant. Of course, he talks about bread. That seems to be one of these prefiguration images. And we can recall, he says, the high priest Melchizedek that we meet in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, who brought bread and wine when he met Abram, and that bread and wine were offered in sacrifice among the first fruits of the earth as a sign of gratefulness to the Creator and giver of every good things. Then he talks also of Leviticus chapter 23, verse 17, and also Exodus chapter 12, verse 33 to 34, where we encounter the unleavened bread, which was used at the celebration of the Passover. He also mentions the gift of manna that sustained the people of Israel during the long journey in the desert. This passage or this story of the manna, we encounter it in Exodus chapter 16, verse 11 to 15. Then he talks about the bread that gave Elijah the strength to reach the mountain of God. 1 Kings 19, 4 to 8. The bread given to Daniel when he was in the lion's den at Babylon, as we see in Daniel chapter 14, verse 33 to 39. And lastly, the showbreads kept in the temple, as we see in Exodus chapter 25, verse 30, and Leviticus chapter 24, verse 5 to 9. And these all point to the direction of the bread of life. The animal sacrifices of communion, expiation, and atonement are also seen as a prefiguration of the Eucharist, as well as the use of their blood, which becomes the sign of the covenant, as we see in Exodus chapter 24, verse 8, and the celebration of the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, verse 1 to 11, and Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1 to 8, the memorial of the saving action of God who had freed the people of Israel from their slavery in Egypt. And this was also repeated once a year by the people of Israel. And of course, this gives us the image. And of course, we have a very beautiful image in the Old Testament that he mentions. That is Isaiah chapter 25, where we see the vision of the banquet that God prepares on the mountain for all peoples of the world. An image illustrating God's great blessings as well as the joy and communion of eating together in intimacy with God and one another. And of course, he immediately comes to the New Testament, which talks about the institution of the Eucharist. And of course, the New Testament, as we all know, if we have a bit of experience with it, has several accounts of the Last Supper and the institution of the Eucharist. Of course, we see this happening in Corinth as handed on to us by Luke and Paul. And of course, we see also from the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John. All these Gospels and part of the writings of St. Paul give us the situation or the account of the institution of the Eucharist. And actually, Father gives a lengthy explanation of what we find about the Lord's Supper at Corinth and the liturgical significance of the Eucharist, where Paul reminds the people that actually at the Eucharist is not like a party where you go and eat and get so full that you don't even remember your brother or your sister. So there it's also cleared for us and made very clear that actually a Christian is a person who partakes in the Eucharist as a sign of communion, as an experience of God's saving presence. And this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 14 to 22. He also talks about the ecclesial dimension of the Eucharist, as we find transmitted by Luke in Luke chapter 22, verse 15 to 20. And also he deals with the whole idea of the Eucharist, the Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels. The Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, when we talk about the Synoptic Gospels, we are dealing with the Gospel of Matthew, we are dealing with the Gospel of Mark, we are dealing with the Gospel of Luke. So those are the Synoptic Gospels that we need to understand and which Father actually has presented to us. And here actually he dwells very strongly on the prophetic ministry of Jesus. And he also reminds us that it is important for us to grasp certain symbolism to understand the depth of the Last Supper. And the prophetic ministry of Jesus includes things like table, fellowship with sinners, which was unheard of at that time, welcoming outcasts like lepers, the woman who was found with a hemorrhage, the Pharisees, the ordinary people. And so many beautiful things happened when Jesus was at table, and there he could narrate the love of the Father, recount his striking parables, spoke of the kingdom. So when we look at the perspective of the way the Last Supper is presented in the Synoptic Gospels and the way Father presents it to us, it is so interesting to understand what God is actually doing for us. And of course, these are very important points that even though we are reviewing this book, and it's my great hope that you're going to get a copy, I would still want to pick up this topic as we continue in our next program to review the book, The Gift of the Sunday Eucharist in an African Perspective, because I do believe that this is a work of art. It is a great literature work that actually will take us a long way in understanding what the Mass, the Eucharist, is for us and the depth of its meaning. So for today, we will conclude there because that is the time that we had. And we have been reviewing The Gift of the Sunday Eucharist in an African Perspective, a book published by Pauline's Publications Africa and written by Father Rinaldo Ronzani, a Comboni missionary. And God willing, next week we shall continue reviewing this book and seeing the different aspects of this book. And in case you'd want to have a copy of this book, you can visit our website page, www.paulinesafrica.org, www.paulinesafrica.org, and you can be able to purchase that book there online, or you can visit any of our bookshops wherever you are. Most of our African main cities, we have a bookshop there. Most of our dioceses, we have a bookshop in the diocese that is affiliated to Pauline's Bookshop, or you can visit any of our bookshops here in Nairobi, either at Catholic Bookshop near Holy Family Basilica, next to Cardinal Tunga Plaza. You can visit our bookshop in Karen at Gabriela House off Bogani Road on Tadale Road. And of course, you can visit Pauline's Communication Center in Westlands here in Nairobi. At this moment, I would want to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Timothy Moreithi for taking time to record and mix this program here at Pauline's studio in Nairobi and in Westlands. for Radio Maria Kenya, Nairobi. So thank you very much, Mr. Marithi. We do appreciate your work. And I continue to encourage you, dear listeners, to be great readers and to encourage others to read. And until next week, I've been your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. And may God bless you all.
You have been listening to the Power of Reading program. Join us next week as we continue discovering the wonderful world of books. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.